Hey, 3DMJers, this is Alberto Nunez, and you're listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. Today, you'll hear my conversation with Eric Helms and Brad Loomis all about how we handle our powerlifters these days. The guys and I talk about how the sport, the athletes, and the culture of natural raw powerlifting have all shifted over the past 5 to 10 years, and how that's affected the way we handle our clients in general. We get specific about training strategies such as exercise selection, rep ranges, RPE assignments, attempt selection, and everything in between. We also touch on nutritional and behavioral components, coaching cues, communication strategies, and what we've stopped doing with our athletes these last 5 years. If you're an athlete, coach, or simply anyone with strength goals, you'll get a ton of takeaways from this episode. As usual, if you have any feedback or comments on this particular episode, head on over to 3dmusclejourney.com or our YouTube channel at youtube.com/team3dmj and leave it under podcast number 146. Thanks so much for listening. Here is 3DMJ Powerlifting in 2020 featuring Brad Loomis, Eric Helms, and myself.
All right, so as I'm beginning to realize, we haven't talked about powerlifting on the podcast in something like 60 episodes. So I think, given that we don't even necessarily do an episode every week, it's been like probably 2-ish years since we've discussed this. I know from our meetings that we're not always coaching our athletes the same way we did a couple of years ago. So I think it would be cool to talk about how does 3DMJ currently handle our powerlifters? What are some things that have changed over the years? And how big of a portion of our roster are our big three enthusiasts? So, Berto, I'm curious about you. Let me know, compared to, say, 2014 through 2016, what's the biggest change for you in the last couple of years?
I don't think I have as many dual athletes. I can think of maybe one that would identify as a dual athlete. So I'd say the biggest thing, and this kind of connects to that, is the fact that in the past, a lot of the powerlifters, especially raw powerlifters, were folks that were bodybuilding at some point, and they decided to try this powerlifting thing. Now, like, powerlifting is big enough where it could legit be like your first contact, your first intro into strength training. So a lot of the habits that kind of, didn't come naturally to us, but we got to build up during that boot camp with bodybuilding, a lot of these modern powerlifters don't have. So that's been, I think, the biggest thing. It's like, well, hold up. What do you mean you don't know what your protein intake is? What do you mean you eat 2 meals a day? It's that was rather foreign, but it's because, legit, we got like athletes who just jump from whatever sport they were doing into powerlifting. It's like, so I guess chicken McNuggets don't count as a meal. And it's like, no, bro, we're gonna have to do things a little bit differently if we want to maximize ourselves. So that's been, I think, the biggest difference with this new batch.
So for you, it's been the nutrition differences, and that you can't assume a certain level of A, knowledge, and B, habits in place or behaviors that are conducive to being a badass powerlifter. You have to actually be like, oh, you don't know what macros are. Like,
yeah,
you don't eat at any kind of regular schedule, etc.
Yeah, it used to be like, hey, you know what, let's calm down a little bit with this. Like, we don't have to do 6 meals a day, right? And now it's like, you know what, we're going to have to tighten up our behavior a little bit, when it comes to things we do outside the gym. So, yeah, absolutely.
That's funny. I've experienced the same thing a little bit. The few times I've gotten, like, I worked with people outside of 3DMJ. So, like, back in, what was that? 2015 or 2016, I did a nutrition presentation for Olympic Weightlifting New Zealand here. It's kind of like their training camp. And, man, I had some people who were, macronators and kind of grew up on some bodybuilding literature. I had some people who were just first real exposure to sport as an adult were Olympic lifters, and it was very much like that. And then I also had a bunch of people who came from CrossFit, and there was a lot of, I should say, I had to re-educate them a lot more than just giving them baseline information. So, yeah, that's interesting now that the sports have grown so much on their own, and powerlifting is so big that we can't expect any kind of level of knowledge, which is both good and bad. Like that gives us some low hanging fruit. Like we get to be magicians. Like, hey, look at you recovering because you eat regularly and eat protein. That's amazing, So yeah, Bradley, how about you? What are some of the big rocks that are in play now that may have not been 4 or 5 years ago?
Really, I think what I've learned through coaching powerlifters has been a pretty unique evolution. It used to be because of my bodybuilding roots, I would oftentimes, kind of prescribe these power builder type of programs where, obviously we got the big 3 lifts in there, but let's just say a robust amount of accessory work, right? And especially over probably the last 3 years, I've noticed how little accessory work we can get away with, and still make those big 3 lifts progress at a fairly rapid rate. And then also, just how some of the physiques look. It's like we're really not doing a whole lot of quote unquote bodybuilding work, and folks are getting jacked. And so I think that's a big evolution that I've gone through, is that we don't really have to anymore. My accessory work is kind of more proactive type accessory work. It's kind of like, okay, let's do calves, but for ankle mobility, let's do face pulls and a little bit of, delt work, but more so for, keeping the ability to keep the shoulders packed, and things like that. I think that's the big thing that I've noticed, and that leads to more time being spent doing the competitive lifts. And that's kind of led to folks that are really good at doing those big 3 lifts, and folks that maybe are not really all that strong, but they put up some big numbers because of the skill that they've developed through, doing those lifts more often.
So it sounds like you're now that bodybuilding and powerlifting for both you are a little more separate, a little more of their own, each standing on their own too, if you will. Brad, that's given you the opportunity to have, I guess, the courage just from the time to see it actually work, to step away from some of it being more of these hybrid bodybuilding powerlifting approaches to explore specificity and seeing that shit that works pretty well too. And maybe all of this, you got to do lateral raises. It's just maybe something that's kind of is a holdover from the way we see training from the bodybuilder's perspective.
Yeah, for sure. Because, let's face it, the reason I wouldn't really let those things go is just what you talk about, the fear. It was, we have to do that or we're not going to be able to, develop this and do that, and et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't until, essentially I was kind of forced to, when folks are just like, I don't have time to do all of these lifts, or they're just recurring practices of not getting the work done that I'm prescribing. And then, it's like one day I look up and it's like, wow, they haven't been doing X, Y, and Z, and yet they're still getting, progress on those lifts and they're still getting jacked, So yeah, that's kind of forced me to let go of that fear, which is, kind of a good thing.
Let me ask you another one, dovetailing off that, Brad, is so you've stepped away from more of the traditional bodybuilding accessories that I'm sure it sounds like you use them to some degree, but they're just not they're not top of the pile and they're not done for the fear-based reasons you mentioned. Does that mean, are you using more lift variations or like specific big 3 assistance movements, like a close grip bench or, a different variation on the squat or bands, chains, anything like that in your training these days? Have you found some utility for specific assistance exercises, quote unquote?
Yeah, for sure. And especially for working around, like little weaknesses and injuries, I guess you might say. Injuries because a particular lift at a particular frequency kind of aggravates something. And so sometimes we can find a similar lift, like you mentioned, something that is not as specific to the lift, but kind of, like you said, a more variant. And we can keep up the same frequency and the same volume without aggravating, that injury. Or sometimes folks just, they're not strong enough to do a lift repetitively over and over again, but they are strong enough to do the good lift that they are the strongest at a lower frequency, and then kind of subsidize that with some sort of a variant. And yeah, that's been kind of a bit of a tangent, but at the same time, something that's been added in, to my toolbox now, just, in the last year and a half, really.
Yeah, that's something I obviously I only handle a handful of clients, but I have definitely found more utility so I'll back up. I think I started like you, superimposing the big three on bodybuilding programs, right? Like we're just going to use this. Bench press will be your horizontal press, and squat will be your squat. And then, deadlift will be your hip hinge. But everything else is pretty much bodybuildery for the most part. And I think I had, limited success with that, especially when I knew how to program and manage load and all that stuff. But then, like you, as I felt more and more comfortable stepping away from that stuff, there was this kind of, I guess you could say, transitional period where I pretty much just used the big three, and I was probably overly specific. And then with a little more experience and seeing, like what frequent issues would come up or what movements seem to be good teaching tools. Like I think Mike T positions these well, positions assistance exercise as well. Like certain movements will punish a bad behavior and reward a good one. Like if you're trying to get someone to be more upright on a squat, you can yell at them all day long, like chest, hips, and then nothing's going to happen. But if you give them a front squat cycle where if they lean forward, the bar falls off them, that's one example where you can see that, or giving someone, certain limited ranges of motion to deal with, pain, where it's really just the bottom where I'm hurt. Well, okay, that's fine. We can do that. So I think like you, my toolbox is a lot bigger now. And that when someone, I would say in 2013, if someone came to me and I was working with them and I had a functional system, like here, do this lift, that's great. We're going to do the big three and just a handful of accessory exercises. They get hurt. That exercise just goes away. Like, all right, we're not squatting. But now I have a lot more options in terms of loading, frequency, variations, to where I'm much more confident that we can even not even just maintain where they're at, but potentially even keep making progress as I know more levers to pull. So that you guys are both nodding your heads, but do you feel like you have that skill set as well?
Yeah, and we have so many more toys now too. It's like, well, okay, so front squat bothers, just try safety bar squat. And then a safety bar squat, it works, but it only works if I, do this and that. Oh, okay. Well, now we've got the transformer bar where we can kind of change that angle a little bit, and so, yeah, just the toys that we have, to find more varieties of that lift, makes it a lot more easy for us to program. And like you said, say, okay, well, we can't squat, but maybe we can do X, Y, and Z.
Berto, have you found a similar transition, or how has this process been for you?
No, yeah, I'd say all of the above for sure. Kind of on that note, because a big thing that Brad brought up was just like the wear and tear, which is, I think, an issue that it's a little bit more difficult to work with in powerlifting compared to bodybuilding, because of, often, like if my squat's not working for whatever reason, my SI joint's giving me trouble or whatever, like there's always some sort of alternative. Usually, it's like I can almost always do something. Like I can, worst come to worst, I can do the BFR thing, and it's like, okay, we're not just sitting there and wasting away. So with powerlifting, it's so important that you keep an athlete healthy, and I think a few things that Brad mentioned is just it reminded me of, I guess, the dark the dark eras of like DUP, where just because the rep ranges were different, it was like, you know what, you can go crazy on each one of these days. And I think just in general, not just us, like the way that's kind of spread out throughout the week, throughout a mesocycle, it's very different compared to back then. And varieties have helped, like having some sort of variation has helped a lot. Like for a lot of people, that day one, which commonly, or it's not uncommon that day one is a high volume day with your traditional like DUP day training setup from back then. Like now it's a what's that thing called? A belt squat, for example. You know, like people are or at least some of
toys,
it is, right? So, I think if you're going to get strong, you're going to have to put together a lot of training blocks where you don't get hurt. And I think just as a whole, like the community's found some very crafty ways of keeping their athletes healthier. Because if you can't squat, it's like, man, well, you can have a hard time being a good powerlifter if you can't squat, you know? That's been huge.
Man, I think that actually opens up a topic that I will try not to make the entire topic because it's something I'm really interested in. But I feel like a lot of the dark era of the DUP days that you're talking about was from this probably overly rigid black and white view of what specificity even is. Yeah. And it's typically, you put it into two boxes that are both overly limiting. One is the specificity of movement, and the other is the specificity of load and seeing how they don't interact. Like, so for example, there was a time point here where even good friends of mine who now know better, they would be like, all right, so it's hypertrophy day in my DUP template, but because of specificity, I'm going to do my sets of 12 on back squats, low bar, competition, and knee wraps and sleeves. And they would belt up when they had the bar as a warm-up, right? And you ask them like, well, if specificity is really that important to you, why are you doing sets of 12 on squats? Well, squats are the most specific thing to squats. And I'm like, honestly, a set of 12 has nothing to do with a 1RM. Like, it might as well be a leg press at that point. It's a continuum. And then I would see like power builders, and this is a mistake that I made more often. I didn't make that one, but this is what I made. Like I'd go through I'm a power builder now, right? So I'm trying to be strong and big. So I want to get strong. So I'm going to go through a strength block. So my tricep push downs, I'm just going to do sets of 4 to 6 on that, you know? And it's like doing bodybuilding accessory work, but heavy because I'm training for strength. That means heavy, like nothing over 8 reps. And this is my strength block. And now I look at that and I go like, do you honestly think sets of 5 are going to transfer better to bench press when you're doing tricep push downs in sets of 15? It's a fucking tricep push down. It's going to have literally zero direct impact on a bench press. The whole reason you're doing tricep push downs is to get bigger triceps so that down the line. So then it's the question of, well, all right, if we can blow up those two myths, then what makes more sense? Well, if I'm going to do bodybuilding work, I want to make it as least stressful as possible. So now it doesn't matter where someone is when I program them for their big 3. If I'm going to program tricep push downs, it's going to be 8+ reps. Because why not? Like I don't want you to have an abusive relationship with your elbow. That's unnecessary, you know. Mm-hmm. And likewise, just like you were saying, Berto, like people are doing their hypertrophy day and they're playing with belt squats. I think they've realized that I don't need to do sets of 8 to 15 on squats, bench, and deadlift. And is the transfer really that much better than doing like hammer strength or dumbbells or close grip even? Like, I really think it's a hard sell. So
at a certain point, not even paying attention. You're just trying to survive the 5 sets of 12. Like you're not even working on all those things all those bad habits that you have in your comp squat. So it's it's so silly in hindsight.
Yeah, and it's difficult because I think the people who can get away with that are more often than not the people who we look up to. You know, the people who are little powerlifting nuggets well built for it. You know, like I hate that I always pick on my wife, but like if you gave Barb 5 sets of 12 on squats, she probably wouldn't squat again for 3 years. You know, like that's the she has to fold in half to do that. And you can think of many examples. Someone with like short arms but a really long body, and their SI joints barely in the quote unquote ideal position when they pull that deadlift off the ground. But you're going to give them 5 by 10? I don't think so. You know, and so like all those kinds of things. Like we look at if we go, I want to look up to like the IPF royalty, and they're all doing highly specific, lots of volume on the big 3. Not all, but it's a predominant portion. But you don't look like them, you're not built like them, that's going to go south real quick. And I think that's what we saw in that dark days of the DUP. It was max intensity, high frequency, max volume, high specificity on the big three. And that can work great if you're, if the first time you ever trained, you had like a 450 Wilks, but it's probably not the case for most of us mortals. All right. So we've talked a bit about how the population has changed. I think people just don't quite realize how much the game has changed. I remember, man, like the first person who really made powerlifting popular in the modern age was a bodybuilder. I think, Lane kind of brought a certain attention to the USAPL on a level that expanded it outside of the people who were just following powerlifters already. I mean, there was definitely like the kind of the West Side predominantly equipped world, but they weren't like broad into the fitness industry. And I think it's interesting because I feel like the rise of raw lifting, power building, and like drug tested powerlifting all happened right around the same time. And it created this really interesting merge between like natural bodybuilding and drug tested powerlifting, which I'd never seen before because the IPF has been drug tested forever, but there was not a lot of crosstalk between the drug-tested powerlifting world and drug-tested bodybuilding world. But that really changed, I would say, like right around 2005. Would you agree with that, Berto?
Yeah. Yeah, it has. And now it's gone to the point where, man, it's like the biggest powerlifting there is it's like the drug-free powerlifting. Mm-hmm. And as a bodybuilder, I'm just like, man, like we don't have it nowhere near close to that on our end. So yeah, is I guess as difficult as it can be that like a certain Fed has like the monopoly on like the drug-free powerlifting. It's like there's some perks to that, man. And if you're a natural bodybuilder, is like, yeah, you understand, you really do appreciate the fact that okay, sometimes they're perhaps a bit overly strict and very missionary, if you will. But man, does that really help sort some things out.
Let me ask you a question. Why do you think that might be? That it was an easy thing for powerlifting, for drug-free powerlifting to become the dominant when it's the polar opposite, or at least, I don't know if it's the polar opposite in bodybuilding. I do think there's a lot of natural bodybuilders, but we know the dominant federations that are more unified and have more power are untested.
Yeah. I'd say because it's a numbers game. Like, like numbers just really, first of all, I think just like across nations, it's the one language we can all speak, whereas like with bodybuilding, it's like, so do we bring in the bikini division? Do we bring in the classic? Is this what our figure girls look like? So there's a lot of things you can disagree on. Whereas like the powerlifting, I've gone through the rule books and I'm like, okay, it's quite a bit of information, but it's very, very clear. So I think that's the biggest thing. You got a subjective sport and a sport that, I mean, it's like more than just football, because with a lot of sports, it's like you need the eye test. Like the stats don't tell you everything. With powerlifting, it's like, no, you could just look at the stats. Like the stats will tell you a whole lot. So I think a sport like that, it's just so much easier to mobilize and have mobilized to the point where like, yeah, it's made up that much ground internationally in like a relatively short amount of time. I mean, the WNBF, they've done a good job with that, but it's just so much harder when, again, because of the nature of the sport.
So I guess what you're saying is that the accessibility of powerlifting means that you'll have a lot more people who are drug-free interested, just because that's kind of the status quo. Like if you just get into lifting, despite what some people in the bodybuilding community might think, like Anavar is not the next step. It is, oh, cool, I can bench, squat, deadlift. Oh, there's competitions for that? Oh, cool, I can track my progress. I can see how I'm stacking up against, the world champions and see how I am in the IPF lifter database. I think that makes a lot of sense because to me it makes sense how there's a huge enhanced population in bodybuilding, because bodybuilding is not something you just rock up to and do. Even with like men's physique and bikini and some of these less extreme divisions, I think like the expectation is that you're micromanaging your whole life. You're changing your entire lifestyle and you're flirting with disordered eating. So I think the people who are willing to go, yeah, I'll try that, are also more likely to be like, yeah, I'll consider anabolic steroids.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me.
Hey guys, this is Andrea. Before we get into this episode, I just want to let you all know about our newest course in the 3DMJ Vault. It's called Transitioning Away from Tracking, and it's the exact course I wish I had 6 years ago when I was still terrified of eating out and had no idea what it felt like to be satiated. While many people have the desire to stop being a slave to the food scale and food tracking apps, they aren't always sure how to do this in a safe, effective, and systematized manner that will allow them to make this shift without diminishing the physical progress they've worked so hard to earn and maintain. In this video-based course, we will give you all the tools that you've been looking for and more. Transitioning Away from Tracking was created by Steve Taylor, our team's registered dietitian, and Eric Helms, our chief science officer. They start with an overview of the science and research surrounding tracking behaviors, present you with the constructs and tactics on how to productively make your transition, and leave you with ongoing tools to ensure long-term effectiveness. This course just came out a couple days ago and only costs $18 for unlimited access to the videos, text supplements, and downloadable resources that accompany it. To learn more about this course from Eric Helms, to sign up for the free trial, or to buy full access, go to 3dmjvault.com. Again, that's 3dmjvault.com to view all of our video courses, including this new one, Transitioning Away from Tracking. Thanks in advance for checking it out, and enjoy the rest of the show.
So I think it makes sense if we look at this culturally, why powerlifting has blown up. And I think, yeah, big kudos, as much as people might not appreciate certain, aspects of having a dominant federation. I think the IPF has really taken that ball and run with it to the betterment of a lot of its athletes. And I would not mind to see the same thing with the WBF if they kept growing at the pace they are, and including more, international affiliates and more athletes and more shows. So that would be great. But do we think there is any potential downside to the powerlifting standing on its own 2 feet? Now that it is, people might come up completely just following IPF lifters, only being aware of raw lifting, not being engaged with bodybuilding. Now that it's got kind of its own ecosphere, has that impacted the way you guys have acted as coaches? Have you had athletes who, I mean, you kind of hinted at this before, Berto, that some people don't have certain nutritional skill sets you wish they did, but is there any other negative echoes of that you guys experience?
You know, my crystal ball looks pretty murky, to be honest with you. Yeah, because
no need to look forward, but I'm just asking: have there been things that you've been surprised that you've had to make coaching points with your younger generation of powerlifters who are pure powerlifters?
Yeah.
You know, you go first, Bert.
It was the same thing. It was just basically that, you kind of like bodybuilding. It's a sport where, you stimulate and then you adapt. You stimulate and then you adapt. So what you do outside the gym, really does matter, whereas like with other sports, like, hey, you might just have a knack for it. You might have an instinct for it. And so you can kind of like, your mind is elsewhere at times, but then game time, it's like, you kind of show up and you do your job. There's just way less wiggle room when it comes to powerlifting. So I think that's been a big one is, it's like, you're going to have to show up a little bit differently when it comes to your training. Like, I guess almost have the bodybuilder's mindset in some way. Bodybuilder walks in, they were bodybuilders many years ago, and they're like, today is like chest and triceps day. And that's what they're focused on. And that's all they're thinking about, So I think getting some athletes to just take practice a little bit more serious, because with powerlifting, it truly is a training session. Truly is a practice session. You can't just show up and because you showed up, you're good and you're still on the team, right? You're just not going to make much progress that way. But then it doesn't stop, and that's where it's very similar to bodybuilding. It's like, okay, if you want to show up recovered more often than not, or as recovered as you can be, you're gonna have to take care of business outside of training, which to a lot of people, like sleeping as much as they need to, eating as much as they need to, or and in a way that they should, is just totally new. So, at a certain point, your athleticism is just going to only take you so far.
Do you think there's more people who come from a team sport background to get into powerlifting or bodybuilding? Have you experienced a lot of your good powerlifters to have played team sports or more mainstream sports, I guess I should say, previously?
Yeah, I'd say a lot of football players. That's well, because you bench press, you squat, you do an ugly deadlift every once in a while. So it's like, hey, I can still do the weight room thing when that's all said and done. So yeah, a lot of football players, so a lot of team sport athletes. So yeah, this is their first go for a lot of these guys, like into a sport where it's like, guess what? It's really on you. Like that's kind of a shock. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think it's pretty kind of a crapshoot whether or not, if you get a competitive bodybuilder, whether they had an athletic background or not. I think there's just as many people who do and as don't, Mm-hmm. A lot of people are drawn to bodybuilding not because they see it as a sport, but more so because they want, certain aspects of that physique, or it's just intriguing to them. But I don't think it's not necessarily viewed as a sport by everyone, even among people who participate in it. But powerlifting, it is a sport. It's an individual strength sport. And I think it makes a lot more sense to me that, considering like there's not an obvious transition from, I worked out with the S&C coach and I got on the field every weekend. So I figured, I'd shave my body and flex in a Speedo. Like, that's not the obvious transition. The obvious transition is, I can't play football anymore, but I really love training. So now I'm going to get involved in that. And you have some kind of that skill set. And especially if you were one of those athletes who performed really well in the weight room, it seems like an obvious transition. Yeah. So I think it is interesting. I see there is a little more of a athletic mindset when you look at just kind of across the spectrum in the IPF. And I think you'll see less. Like, I have more head scratching or facepalm moments when I deal with kind of the bodybuilding community. And I think sometimes it is from people who have never really been involved in sports, Yeah. And an example is like the pushback you get against deloads. Like, oh, I see. Yes. This is a community of exercise obsessed people, not athletes who came to this. Like, everyone else understands the deload and the value. So yeah.
And how tough you can coach up some of these athletes because they like legitimately need it. It's like you weren't talking loud enough. It's like, oh, he's just messing with me. He doesn't really mean that. And like when you're like, you know what, like we need you like to step up and like you really, really give it. Like they thrive off that. So that's been a big thing is especially athletes who, hey, they have a few years of like college football under their belt. It's like, yeah, how I speak to them is going to be a little bit different compared to, that person who just didn't want to be fat and they got a little carried away with it, and now they're on their way to the stage. So right. Yeah, that's been a huge, like, the way we communicate, super important. I think we've talked about this many times, that you have to talk differently, like depending on who you're dealing with and what stage they're in, and their prep, off season, year development, overall development. But with these athletes, it's like literally I feel like a football coach, a high school football coach from Texas. Like, it feels that intense at times. So nice.
Brad, how about you? Have you had any coaching or personality differences you noticed between the earlier crop and the latest crop of powerlifters you work with?
The only thing that comes to mind is the shift of highly regulated competitions. And so what I mean by that is back earlier in the decade, it seemed that it was pretty easy to just, go to a meet and, just roll up there with your belt, your singlet, maybe some wraps and, just lift. And, I think that was kind of the allure of it. You didn't have to shave your whole body and tan and go through all this crap, in order to compete. You could lift, you can enjoy your training, and then one day you decided you just kind of rock this singlet for a day, and try to set some PRs. And that was kind of fun because, you could kind of compete on an impromptu basis in a way. It's like, oh, hey, look at, the training's going really good right now. There's this competition coming up, over in on the corner over here at this gym, and maybe we just go ahead and we'll do our test on that particular meet day, and it wasn't any big deal. But now
we used to literally call them PR parties back in the day when we all used to compete.
Oh yeah,
in California.
Yeah, and that was a fun thing, when you could just do that. But now with the popularity, of especially raw powerlifting, it tends to get a little bit too regulated and it loses a little bit of its allure. It's like, okay, well, You mean if I go to this meet, I have to buy a special singlet with a special name, and I can't have the singlet that I've always used, that is like my good luck singlet that I'm afraid to wash because I've set 4 PRs in it, and things like that. Or
Probably should
like
wash it, but
That's nasty. But yeah.
how suspicious people can be. Or it's like, oh, I've always, I've won this championship in this particular league, and if I do this one, I can't go back, and so just little things like that can be frustrating, and those are things that have popped up like in the last few years. And if there was going to be a demise of it, I think it would kind of almost, root itself in that, like I said, just over regulation of it. You have to do things in this way, and you have to do, you can't just roll up and have fun like it used to be, and that could turn some people off. It's like, well, I don't want to do that, and plus I kind of choke under that kind of pressure, and yeah, I think that could potentially be a downfall, although it's not showing any signs of it right now. It's only getting stronger. It seems like the more that we seem to, because along with that auto regulation comes a lot of legitimacy, right? Did I say auto regulation?
I do mean auto regulation. You're all good.
I'm sure I'm glad you guys listened to what I meant and not what I said. But yeah, with all of that regulation comes a lot of legitimacy, and it kind of makes the sport just, seem a little bit more NFL-ish or MLB-ish, or NBA-ish.
Yeah, and that does. I think where that loops into coaching is that you do have to prepare your athletes for that. They need to know that they're probably going to do a gear check. And you might not be able to change your weight class. Like if you rock up and you don't make weight, they might not allow you to lift in the heavier weight class if it's too crowded. You might have to go home. And knowing that. Yeah, you actually have to look at the gear list and get the right length wraps for your wrists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think those weren't things that I was too concerned with back in, say, 2011. If I coached a powerlifter, I'd be like, yeah, just show up on time, and then here's your attempts, and that was pretty much it. But the I will say, hell, I remember. I went to an IPF meet, and I had to go home and get new underwear one time. Fortunately, I was close because I was like, "Oh, that's right. I'm wearing boxer briefs, and these aren't the right kind of underwear. Like I could be getting an extra gram out of my squat from these." So, yeah, I think it's in the grand scheme of things, it's not a big deal, and it's like you said, Brad, it hasn't. Dampen the growth of the sport, but it is for anyone who's been around for a while and kind of appreciated at least the pros of the mom and pop feel of you just hang out and it's a bunch of people who like to sort of semi-legitimize their lifts. I think it is like the big nature of it is A, cool, and B, is part of the reason why it's legitimized, but it's also, it loses a little bit of that kind of backyard rumble feel that I kind of liked, if I'm honest. All right. So another question I have, and I'm going to preface it with what I do differently these days than I used to. I think you brought up auto-regulation accidentally, Brad, and I'm going to roll with that.
And you're just going to roll with it.
Absolutely. When I was first, learning and getting deep into the periodization research and trying it out and playing with it, I kind of bought into the whole top-down plan out a whole competition cycle. And I would sometimes write 8 to 12 week blocks for someone and think about how each thing led to the next and how every single, and try to balance all of the load and carefully manage it. And now I find myself, I write about 3 weeks to 4 weeks of training at a time for someone. And there's built-in elements of auto-regulation just because I don't believe that I'm making the best decision if I gave someone basically what amounts to 2 or 3 mesocycles in a row. And when even then back in the day, I'd end up having to change it anyway from from the feedback of the athlete. So I'm curious, have you guys gone from more of a top-down to a bottom-up approach over time? Have your mesocycle lengths changed? How do your programs differ now compared to, say, 4 or 5 years ago? Brad, why don't you kick it off?
I definitely have a categorical way that I kind of do things. So like if it's say a novice lifter that's like, I want to try this powerlifting thing, then yeah, I may write them like an 8 or 12 week, mesocycle of training, and put some thought into it and make sure that we're deloading and using linear periodization and things like that, and that I feel comfortable with. However, the higher level powerlifters, I almost am afraid to do that. Like you, I will really only plan a couple, 2-3 weeks at a time. And even then, I'm always fearful of what's going to happen in between there, and so sometimes it's like, I almost insist on adjusting things kind of weekly, so I'll have my big calendar where it's like, okay, this is what I've got planned out, on this mesocycle is this focus and this mesocycle is this focus, and I'll have my notes. And so I'll have my big picture plan. But I like to walk through that plan, kind of in at least a bi-monthly, but preferably weekly, kind of a adjustment schedule. And so if everything's going great, yeah, I'll go ahead and stick to my big picture plan and, just go with the adjustments that are kind of in my calendar in a way. But it seems like it never fails that I always end up having to, at some point, kind of get away from my calendar, or just shorten up a particular block or change the focus of something that, maybe I had planned. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know that I've ever had the comfort of just saying, okay, I'm going to give you 8 weeks of training, check back with me, in 8 weeks, or email me if something goes awry in the middle, unless they were just a novice that was kind of wanting to look at, try out this powerlifting thing.
Yeah, that's very much the same with me. I can specifically remember, like, we've had weekly athletes, right? And I write them an 8-week block. I put it in their spreadsheet, and they check in and let me know how it's going every week. But I would not want to change the plan. And I would feel like, well, we need to get to the 8-week mark and do your AMRAPs or your 1-rep maxes. Then I can know whether everything worked. And it was very much like this binary look at it. Like, this 8-week block exists in its own little vacuum. It's all right or it's all wrong, and either the maxes went up or they didn't, instead of me having the confidence and the skill set, and I would say the philosophy, which is much more accepted now because of guys like Mike T, hopefully some of the work I've done, but just kind of making it okay to not take this kind of top-down approach of, look, I'm the master guru controller of, crystal ball periodization, where I can predict your 1RM sometime in July 2023. And here's the progression cycle for it. But now going, right, so this is a push and a pull and a what's going on in your life. And we're going to use not only just RPE, but I might adjust your volume, your exercise selection, even the number of days a week per training, which days you train. I think that is something that, just that being okay and seeing high-level lifters and coaches doing it kind of allowed me to take a different tact. And then once I did, man, I never looked back. So, yeah, I'm the same as you there. Berto, how about you, man?
Well, no, first of all, co-sign on everything you guys said, because I've been there before. And yeah, the only time I actually will write something where it's like, all right, it's like 12 weeks of just, like do what's there, and then, have an assessment here, and then do what's there, and then keep going, is like early intermediates, where like they're actually pretty predictable, once you've done this enough, and based on like how they're put together and which ones are their strong lifts, you can kind of guesstimate where they're going to be. But more than anything, they just need to get into the habit of like lifting is study time, It's like, okay, when we're at the gym, it's like, all right, stop like DMing so and so, it's time for you to like just get the book out and like do your thing. I think that's a very valuable skill because I think for a lot of people, eventually their volume cap has a lot more to do, or not a lot more to do, but part of it is like, where's your focus at? Do you have that ability to focus on what it is that you need to do? Because, man, like I remember when they asked Boris Shaiko about like the accessories on some of his programs, and he's like, it's just to keep the athlete entertained. To be quite honest, that's what a lot of that stuff is, because it's a lot of doing the same stuff over and over again. So yeah, I kind of helping them develop a sweet tooth for that. That's probably the only time I'll use something like that. But I prefer to do it the way you said, Eric. Outside of that, I'd say valuable things. Sets where we ramp up load has been a big one, because you'll have those days where you kind of feel trashy, right? And then you go in there and you hit your first set of 4, and then you're like, oh, okay, like that. Let me see the phone. Oh, shoot, that was like a sub 6 RPE. Even though like rep 1 or when I unracked it, I didn't really think I was going to move all that well. So now you have confidence and you ramp up. So I think those confident building sets, especially during parts of the week where we're just kind of expecting to be a little bit more fatigued and tired, those are super valuable there, and we end up making it a very good practice session. I'd say the other one, and this is just big across powerlifting right now, is just those singles at a 7 to 8 RPE. Yeah. I think they keep you in tune with where your recovery is. You kind of start to see that, it kind of does do that. But I think the big one is that it really helps with like a meet day management. Like if you kind of know what singles like RPE 8, 7-ish around there and up feel like, it's going to help you make the right calls come game day. You'll be able to give your coach or your handler much better feedback. So that's been it's been great, because it makes how the relationship between fitness and fatigue, it makes that relationship a little bit more transparent. And then it's obviously it helps a lot with game day decisions as well.
Yeah, and I really like your segue there into using RPE, because I've even really kind of changed my approach to explaining RPE to folks anymore. And I did this a long time ago, just for kind of like for myself, kind of going by what a particular RPE feels like. And I made this little chart that kind of, says, okay, this is usually what this feels like. It's the one that, felt like it slowed down, but it didn't look like it, and kind of assigning more so speed of the load that you're moving, as opposed to kind of like the traditional RPE where 9 is 1 rep left in the tank, or 8.5 is 2 reps left in the tank. Sometimes it's really hard to assess that kind of a thing, especially like what if you're doing, like you said, like a double at an RPE 7.5 or 8. I just want something that's on there that is heavy but doesn't slow down. And sometimes people will equate a heavy double to, oh, well, they need to be, hard repetitions. And it's like, no, I want it heavy, but it should look like a normal lift. You know what I mean? And sometimes it's kind of hard to tell a beginner intermediate, okay, I want a single, but I wanted a 1 rep max. I wanted a single where it's a teensy bit slower than how it normally looks. And usually that correlates well to an 8.5, which, usually correlates pretty darn well to if I had a gun to your head, you could do 2 more, And so I've really kind of gone more so the way of assessing RPE kind of like in the heat of the moment when you're underneath that bar and looking at how the speed of that load and how that bar is moving. And so then therefore, like you said, Eric, I'll just say, okay, you know what? Here's our minimum, our maximum. I want you to use no less than this amount of load, but no more than this amount of load. And I want you to get an RPE 8.5 to where it's just a little bit slow. And then even like with Berto, I never really even thought about that, but I'll use kind of like, ascending sets. And I'll say, okay, you know what? If it didn't feel like an RPE 8.5, I'll let you go ahead and do another one. I'll let you try again, but only 2 attempts at that 8.5. So that's kind of been getting back to things that I've changed, a lot here in like this just the last year or so. Just defining that RPE more so when you're in the heat of battle instead of trying to guess, kind of in what do you want to call it, an outward
Perspective.
way of how many reps I have left in the tank,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a very different kind of approach to training, because you're basically, I think the pushback I would have given to that 5 years ago would have been like, well, but I don't want the athlete to make the wrong decision. Like, I want to control that for them. I'm going to give them the right number. And I think now I realize that the athlete getting the opportunity to get the wrong number is really important for their development, because they're going to end up having to be on the platform choosing attempts, And like the principal skill that a powerlifter needs is to be able to gauge how much do I have left in me. And so this kind of fear-based pushback, like, I can't have athletes use an RPE. I got to give them a percentage. I want an objective number. It's like, you were telling them, I don't want you to learn the main lift skill you need, for your sport. So, and it's funny, like, and now I'm much more comfortable with that resulting in, like you said, two singles that when I originally thought it was going to be one at an attempt at 8.5, or more warm-up sets, Like I've sometimes I'll program, give me an overwarm single at a 7, because I want the person to build up more and more, have more opportunities to gauge and develop that skill. And I'm thinking of it much more from kind of their autonomy and their competence building with how they can feel what lifting is like, because I've seen that pay off on the back end. But that's definitely a new perspective, where previously it was like, there's something magic about the number of sets I'm giving you. I chose the number, and probably not for any good or logical reason. But now that I've chosen it, this is the magic formula, and I cannot change it because periodization,
Yeah, and I think it even makes lifters communicate better information to their handlers, when you can come off of there and say, wow, that felt like an RP 7.5. It really did not even feel slow. And if it doesn't even feel slow, it gives you an idea of how much you can go up, and then you can kind of look at your competition, especially if it's like a deadlift, and you can kind of say, oh, well, you know what, we can kind of strategically plan this to where if we're conservative now, we could be more aggressive later, or if we're more aggressive now, then we can be conservative later. And it just seems like once they develop that skill, and you let them miss a couple of times, we see videos of our lifters, and they're like, yeah, that was an RP 7.5, and I'm like, that was significantly slower than you usually lift. Oh, okay, well, obviously I misgauged that. They need to kind of learn to fall, before they can get good at jumping.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on that same topic of using singles and using RPE, I think, kind of going back to what I was saying, how I used to not feel like I knew, quote unquote, whether or not a block worked until I'd done a 1RM test. Now I'm much more comfortable having an idea of whether or not at all times, whether things are, quote unquote, working, And I think I felt like before, because I bought into this kind of top-down hype about periodization, that, all right, I'm going to put this DUP program in a box, and I don't know what's going on in the black box, but either you got stronger or you didn't. And then, all right, open the box back up, change the volume a little bit, give it back to you. Either got stronger or you didn't. And now I feel so much more comfortable being fluid in that I have a few, ideally, if the lifter's on board with it and they have the requisite skill set and personality, I have a few reasonably heavy sets in there that are RPE and low rep, and they give me an idea of where the person's at. And I think, previously I would have been like, well, you can't do a single at a 7 during a volume block. And now I'm kind of like, why? What are you talking about? Like, and I think having let go of some of these rules that were, initially you need these rules so that you can actually formulate and understand the structure of programming. But once they become debilitative and limiting, and you have no, defense as to why you're doing it, except for that's how I used to do it, I think that's a great opportunity to start playing with some of these concepts. I know for me, man, I love having some singles, anywhere between, honestly, a 5 to a 10 RPE in a block of training, because it just lets me know where they're at, and I can smooth those transitions if I do want to have a period of training that's a lot more accessory and volume based. Like if I have a lifter who I really think just needs to get bigger, just having a couple singles at even a 6 or a 7 RPE it does wonders for having them maintain that lift. So yeah, that was a really good one that you brought up before, Berto. It's kind of like a meta concept and application from this whole auto-regulation thing.
Oh, and you know what helps people learn even faster? This is one of the perks to social media is that powerlifters, they'll call each other out on their bullshit. You know, if someone's like RPE 7, they're like, no, bro, no. Like, you're a liar. So I like that part. That, like, you know, hey, sometimes there's these scuffles and things get a little complicated, but like I think it expedites because like with sometimes, you know, our bodybuilders can be a little bit like, hey, blood and guts, you know, hell yeah, like, you know, those last 2 reps on the squat, your T-spine was rolling like that old Pete Rubish video with his high bar squats, you know, but you know, you did it, right? And with powerlifting is a little bit different. It's there's just again, it goes back to the numbers because numbers decide what something is why something is working or not necessarily what looks like super glam on a black and white like training video. You get brought up to speed really quick by the community, and I do like that bit where you know, like if lifter throws out something out there that's kind of like he'll be usually corrected, and you'll be corrected in a pretty polite way, like more often than not. So that's I think a tool that we didn't have back then. Like in regards to peer review, you remember we would just like all we did was like plan out the microcycle. We throw it up on bodybuilding.com, and some big dude that was like 250 pounds and like not natural to say the least. Just tell us no, that's too much bicep work, and that's just because I know, you know. So yeah. Again, like the numbers have made. Like when bodybuilding went through that one period where like, hey, 1 in 100 bodybuilders, they have glutes. And like now it's to the point where if you go to a good open, see a good open class, amateur class, it's like you better be in shape because a lot of dudes are going to look like that 1 in 100 dude. And with powerlifting, it's just gone by so quick. And every year it's like we learn so much, myself included. But I think more importantly, like as a young lifter, it's like, yeah, you get brought up in a fairly efficient way.
And on the flip side, in defense of you know, Eric's black box that he talked about in the DUP days, I mean, you know, why was it that we were afraid to do a single at 7? It was because that black box worked, you know.
Yep.
And it worked really well, you know. And so it's like, well, if it works so good, that's the reason I'm afraid to change it. But at the same time, it's kind of like when things go awry, and you can't squat, you know, it's like, well, what do? I have to use my black box because it works so good. And if we do anything else, it's not going to work, you know? So that's the one thing that I will say in defense of the black box is it wasn't just because you said so and because, you know, it was just because it actually worked, you know, but it's just like we have to kind of think to ourselves, well, what's the plan B then? You know, what happens when, you know, normally you can get this kind of a load, but you didn't have any sleep the night before, or you helped your, you know, girlfriend move or what have you. That's where you get that plan B or plan C or plan D or whatever it is that you need to do so that you can keep progressing. But maybe it's just not to the rigidity of the black box that worked so well before.
No, that's true. It's not like it's not like these concepts, especially if you're paying attention and you're reading the right literature and you're experimenting with your athletes. It's not like these are foundations of sand that we're building on top of, right? So that black box, that like the jokingly titled Helms Co programs I wrote, you know, 5-6 years ago, they were based off of what seemed to be the average amount of volume and the patterns and the things that I'd had with, you know, 40 plus athletes for a couple of years. I think around that time I was probably working with more powerlifters than anyone else on the team. And I also was like, you know, learning from Zerdos and Tushir and just reading everything about this and experimenting on myself. And yeah, so I built these 8-week block cycles that were, I think, pretty well constructed. But I think that's exactly it, Brad, is that what if you went through a really stressful period or like what if you got sick or what if you went on vacation or Or just what if, you didn't fit that mold exactly and we needed to adjust volume, et cetera, et cetera. Do you really want to adjust volume after 7 weeks of pounding yourself into dust? Or do you want to do it on week 2 when I'm expecting you to be pretty fresh, but you're absolutely trashed? So I think they really just lacked versatility, was the thing. And I think that's the difference now. Because, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think there's a lot of really good concepts in some of the more rigid approaches to powerlifting programming. But really, I think kind of this auto-regulation revolution or this bottom-up approach is just to say, great, what do I do when things don't go according to plan? Which, like we've talked about, happens more often than not. It still fits within the framework. I mean, just as simple as adding RPE to something. It's just saying like, we'll just make sure the amount of stress I want you to experience is what you're experiencing. And then you just have to find the equivalent for volume, frequency, exercise selection. And I think that's something that when you frame it that way, we can all understand. It's not down with periodization. It's more like periodization, yes, but no plan survives contact with the enemy. So we need to have a way to adjust it. So that's well said. Another thing, though, the current generation of powerlifters, there was actually a really hilarious video. I think it was on Alan Thrall's channel, but they had a USPA and a USAPL lifter archetype. Did you saw that, Berto? I was laughing my ass off.
That was awesome.
So Silent Mike was playing the USAPL lifter, and he's filming every set, spending all this time perfectly wrapping his wrists, putting on his SBD sleeves and belt, and then checking the video on every single one of his lifts, rating the RPE, messaging his coach to ask if he could, grab like teriyaki chicken after the thing or not, or if he could go off plan and do a certain accessory, and just overly focused on technique and cueing himself. All this stuff is hilarious. And then of course the USPA lifter was just yelling and talking about Metallica and how many injuries they had, and I think there was right now, if I go to a gym and if I see somebody wearing an SBD shirt and wearing a belt and knee sleeves and squatting and filming themselves, I immediately know what's up, and they probably train by themselves most of the time or with maybe one other person. But back in the day, talking just 10 years ago even, if you wanted to train as a powerlifter, you'd find a powerlifting gym or a group of powerlifters and you guys would get together for ME or DE day, or at least even if you weren't in the West Side world, squat, bench, or deadlift day. And you would get together and you would get all this immediate feedback and camaraderie. And I think there's definitely something lost in the current crop that have, big ass headphones on the whole time. They say no words to anybody. And most of the time, those 2 words are the person says, "What?" And they go, "Oh, sorry, I was talking to myself. I just said hips." They're reviewing their video the whole time. They're on their phone, but it's just to track training and record it. And I think there was a certain key piece to the community of powerlifting and the supportive nature and even fast tracking of learning that came from being in one of those groups that is now just not nearly as present or frequent. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, let's face it. I mean, I kind of suspect that is one of the reasons that CrossFit is so popular right now. Is because you do get that community feel and you do get that immediate feedback. Where it's kind of like, well, you need to do this and you need to do that, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, let's face it. I mean, there's usually a lot of rah-rahing, and a lot of cheering, and you look at some of those old West Side videos of those guys getting ready to do their lifts. I mean, you want to talk about rah-rah. Good Lord. There was no way you were going to miss a lift in that type of an environment. And it's funny that you bring that up, Eric, because that was kind of something that I tried to rekindle about a year ago here in our little community, was to get that community vibe with powerlifting, going again. Cause I mean, I came on the scene, fairly late with powerlifting. It was 09, 2010, 2011, but there was still a lot of that community experience, kind of like the football team, that would just download right onto the gym and just, yell at each other. And I'll be darned if that didn't just fail epically. We were going to provide coffee and, we got the we got the officiating lights out and the whole 9 yards, and we got donuts and everything. And I think one person showed up.
Yeah, because I mean, there was a time point where that was easy to do, or that was the only way to do it, almost.
Yeah.
I remember when you hosted Meat Sip in Portola, and you were a gym owner still, and like I think raw powerlifting is great in that it opens the door for anybody. There's no barrier to entry, but equipped powerlifting, it forced you into getting a community. There was no other way to do it. Like if you're going to put on a bench shirt, that ain't happening alone, and that's one thing I can say is that equipped powerlifting, the powerlifting that we, man, when Berto and I first did meets, we were just basically showing up without a baseball glove to play baseball. And it's like, no, there's no raw division. Yeah, you can squat without a squat, so you can bench without a bench shirt. You're just going to place last. And we were like, all right, well, I guess we're just here for PRs, which is probably good for the way we viewed the sport, But I remember, man, it took a couple years even before the Meats and Chips gym had raw divisions, So yeah, I think that is probably a missing element that you have to be more intentional to create these days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I never even thought about that community need for just putting the bench shirt on, or getting those wraps so freaking tight that you need an extra long pair of pliers, in order to pull the tail through. You're not doing that yourself, But that's a good point. I never even really thought about that.
Yeah, man. It's something that I think you will get in certain spots. Like there's a few gyms here in Auckland that are powerlifting gyms, and people get that, and they do really, really well, and they thrive. And those communities are typically where you have a really good local environment. Like Berto, I'm sure you've seen the same thing in certain spots in Colorado because like everyone's there. But yeah, it's something. Sometimes I think our athletes, that's something we try to do with our athletes is try to create that for them online because it may not be where they are locally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, I think how it goes. Like things on social media look a little different, and it might seem that way. Like a lot of these guys have these 4 side spotters, and it's like, man, I wish I was lifting in that gym with Russ Wall or whatever. But it's usually because Russ Wall is there. So like if you're not fortunate enough to live like next to like one of these like top dog lifters, it's probably you're probably going to be Silent Mike from that video you were talking about, which I highly recommend. Like it's Mike does such a good job of playing that role. By the way, that was scary good.
Oh, it's an amazing video. Yeah. And there's Alan Thrall yelling, "Hup." Yeah, it's great. So good. Oh, man. Talking about how he missed the meet because he was on parole. Good stuff. Anyway. All right. So I think we've talked about bottom-up programming. We've talked about our changing position as coaches, auto-regulation, writing shorter blocks, being unpleasantly surprised by a lack of nutritional awareness among the newer crop of athletes, needing to have them be more focused and more attentive to the realities of meet day. And yeah, I think, so anything else that you guys can think of that you focus more on now as powerlifting coaches in 2020 than you did previously?
I don't know if I necessarily focus on this particular thing that I'm doing now, but it's very reassuring to kind of see some legitimate evidence, I guess you might say, in what I've noticed anecdotally. And specifically what I'm talking about is you guys have done a few mass roundtables on like variable resistance, and bands and chains and things like that. And so, yeah, I always played with them on, using myself as kind of the guinea pig, you know what I mean? And every now and then I would kind of use what I knew and use it on this person and that person. But it's kind of like, well, for example, overload, deadlifts, that for me was a big spurt in my strength in deadlifting. But it was like, I'm not going to use that for anybody. It worked for me, but this crazy thing doesn't, I can't really even explain why it worked,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, now that we have some more evidence, to the reasons why it works, and there's legitimate people that are out there saying, yeah, you would use it in this way and in this manner at this particular time. I find myself using them a little bit more. I'm willing to use them. Let's just say that, and the reassurance is there now that I'm not crazy, and it's these things that I did see anecdotally, that there was a reason, why they worked. They're a little bit more legitimate,
Yeah, I almost think kind of like that. That's almost kind of the pendulum swinging back in the evidence-based community to where we used to be like dogmatically, you better show me a study to do anything, or I'm going to make fun of you or be condescending. To now it's saying like, hey, anecdotes are valuable too, and like you can use things, you can try them. And there's really low cost, and it's acceptable in our community to try to do things. Like you won't get beat up by the PubMed police if you do, some different accessory work. I think that's something that's people are hopefully it seems to me, are much more open to accepting people just trying things. And I think before we used to preload ourselves as evidence-based professionals of if someone's doing this, that means they're West Side, which means they believe this, and that means I have to debunk them. And it's like, or maybe they are just stuck on their deadlift and they're trying something. They're like, I seem to be weak on lockouts. Maybe I can try overloading the top with the chain. It doesn't actually mean that I pray at the altar of Louis Simmons. So I think, absolutely.
And that's a good point too, Eric, is like I'm willing to try these things, but it's not just random. I'm not just doing it just because. It actually is for a specific purpose. It's because this person's deadlift is stuck and we're trying this for the purpose of making the deadlift better. I'm not just doing it just because it looks cool,
Absolutely.
Or just throwing this in there,
stones, right? And like I think that's what any good coach should be doing. It's like you turn over the stones that you expect to potentially lead to enhanced performance. And when you're out of stones, you can't just throw your hands up. You've got to be like, well, maybe there's some stones here that I'm not aware of, or that other people have turned over, and you try them. But yeah, I do think now that there's a little less of kind of a dogmatic approach to what we consider okay to try. It's taken the handcuffs off some coaches, and hopefully also provided them some structure and a framework to understand how and when to do that. So I think this is all really good stuff. I think we've covered a lot. One other thing that I was thinking of, and we'll see if I can grab it before it slips out of the back of my brain, because I've started to forget what it was. One thing that I have done a little bit differently these days is attempt selection. And this has probably been the same way for the last 4 or 5 years, but I think when we first got into powerlifting, Berto, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was almost always the same thing. Like second attempt, you'd equal your PR that you'd done typically on a lift on that day that you trained isolation. Like you had a bench day, a squat day, a deadlift day, and then be some bodybuilding days. So like when I used to do my powerlifting meets, second attempts for all 3 lifts were whatever my best I'd ever done in that last cycle was, period. And then third attempts with PR, It's not as bad as some of the ridiculous shit I saw where it was like, open on a PR and you get 3 shots to build on it, But I've definitely come full circle there, I would say, in the last 6-7 years. This has kind of been the thing, to where now I'm thinking about building a total, thinking about the overlapping stress, the psychological position you're in if you miss your opener on squats, where you might be if you just made weight, and how we might need to potentially drop your opener on squats to allow some time for you to get caught up. And then, all right, how do I put together the best total possible? And just being open to the idea that you might just not have it today, and that's okay. So if we have to be 2.5 less than your last comp, but we get a better total, that's still a win. So yeah, I think that's a big one. Matt Gary has been a really positive influence on me, along with some other people who follow that same thing. And in general, you see that especially the IPF community, you see people getting more lifts and getting closer to what they're probably their maximals on the platform. It's not just like going 9 for 9 and opening at 100 kilos and just going up 2.5 each time. It's trying to play the Price is Right. The biggest number you can do without going over.
Yeah, that was huge. That was crazy to me the first time I heard about it being done that way. It's like, if my lifter doesn't get a PR on meet day, then I failed as a coach. Like that was
Exactly.
that was the way I saw it. Yeah. You know what's even sillier is the guys that plan for like 2 attempts. They have 2 attempts on lift. I'm like, well, why don't you just take your last warm up and get on the board just in case, because you never freaking know, right? But yeah, no, that's huge, and especially like in like here in the U.S. with the USAPL, it's like if you miss a lift, like that might send you down 5 places. So people are extra cautious about like, yeah, you know, like you said, not necessarily going 949 just for the sake of like sandbagging and saying like, yeah, I've never missed a lift in comp, but to maximize. And I think over time that really shows you like when you look at the database in the USAPL, like those lifters, it's, you know, miss few lifts. It's like you see one trend, like a very common trend, and that's that they just continuously get better over time, because I think that kind of reflects on the rest of their training as well. You know, that they're being careful with themselves and thinking long term.
You know, it's even crazier to me. Sorry, go ahead, Brad.
Well, I was just going to kind of end on that particular subject. I thought it was very eye-opening and such a smart decision when I want to say it was a couple years ago when Bryce Lewis actually lowered his last deadlift attempt because he didn't need to get the number that he originally had in order to win. He was going to win with a lower attempt. And that kind of is, I think, a good illustration of what you talked about there with attempt selection. You know, it's like, that is such a smart thing, you know, that you would not necessarily think of. Well, let's not worry about the PR. Let's worry about winning today or getting the total that you're after, et cetera, et cetera. So, I just kind of wanted to put that
You got 363 days a year besides Worlds and Nationals to get a PR, you know? Like,
Yeah.
The craziest thing to me now, the more I think about it, with the attempt selection strategies we had in the early 2000s, is we were completely not open to the idea of doing a squat, bench, and deadlift in the same day on training. I remember specifically being on the bodybuilding.com forums, and one of the big guys, I don't remember his name, but he was actually someone I interacted with a fair bit, and he was way ahead of his time. I want to say it was like 07 or something like that. And he'd be like, yeah, you know, on Saturdays I do a mock meet. I do a practice meet. And I was just like, with no justification, I was like, that's dumb. You know, you can't do squat, bench, and deadlift on the same day. That's so tiring. You can only do that on competitions. And then I'm like, sweet, you know, I only benched on this day and I hit that as a PR. That'll be my second attempt, you know? It's like, I have no idea the kind of fatigue I'm going to experience on the platform, because every time I train bench, like the next hardest thing I do is like a dumbbell shoulder press. And when I do deadlifts, it's pretty much the only damn thing I do in the gym. And after, you know, squats, I might do like, you know, some lunges or something like that. But I'm content to think that after 3 squats and 3 benches and 2 deadlifts, I'll be able to easily go for a PR every time, you know? So it's mind-boggling to me that those two things were in coexistence. Never train the 3 lifts together, but on game day, take a super aggressive attempt strategy. Yeah, that'll go great. But back then, nobody gave a shit how many attempts you got. They only gave a shit like, so did you get a PB? You're like, yeah, man.
Yeah.
And it's like, I went 4 for 9. I only got my opener on bench, but it's all good, you know.
It was like 2 198s in your class, so it's like,
it doesn't matter, right? You know.
Yeah.
So I think it's I think a lot of the things, the greater participation in the sport, the fact, like, man, I think people just don't even realize it. Like the qualifying total for the 93 class at Nationals is 750 kilos right now. That's over a 500 bucks. It's crazy. You know
That's
what I'm saying?
insane for a national level. Yeah.
It's so deep that, you know, like, because the way they do set it up is it's supposed to be the class 1. And class 1 is like 670 or something like that. But if there's so many people in the class, they just take the average of the 30th place total, which means that at USAPL Nationals, the person placing 30th is totaling 750 in the 93. It's like, what the hell is that? You know?
Sheesh.
It's just insane.
We would have not believed it. Like we would have like back in 2011, 2012. It's like, no, there's some sort of like doping scandal going on. There's no freaking way.
They've got squad briefs underneath those symbols. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just it's interesting to see now with the greater participation, which means and social media. Like there's downsides to both those things. like the mom and pop field's not there, and the social media has so many downsides. I don't even need to bring them up, but it also creates this awareness and this back and forth to where the intellectual level of the average lifter, the average coach, is getting leveled up a lot faster, which I think is great. So it's good to see that we're staying up with those times, and that in programming, coaching, attempt selection, nutrition, we do things in many ways quite differently than we did, say, even in just 2015 or 2016.
And it's making some ridiculously strong powerlifters.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
That it is. The funny thing is we're not that much stronger. Berto's the only one who's actually gotten over a 500-pound squat. So, why can't we benefit from our own coaching? I don't understand this.
Yeah.
I'm getting this weird little spurt in the late 30s, which is the fun part about the powerlifting thing. It's I think people think of it as a young guy sport. It's no, if you learn to lift, man, you can do this for a really long time. That's again, to me, I couldn't imagine now partaking in a sport where it's hey, you know what? After 25, you're really going to be fighting to just be something close to that 25-year-old. So, man, when you talk about the best sports I could have picked for the sake of my ego, I am so glad that it was powerlifting and bodybuilding. It's
absolutely
we're probably gonna do some pretty gnarly things going into our 40s, you and I, Eric, which we're getting closer, right? And that's,
there's no hope for Brad or Jeff, but for us there still is.
Well, in your opinion, there's no hope. For me, I'm training every day with that glimmer of hope.
Actually, you're crushing it lately, Brad. You've been hitting some big numbers on deadlifts, I've seen. So
yeah, just not my traditional deadlift like we were talking about earlier in the episode. Those variants, that are giving me that glimmer of hope and giving me that drive and that motivation and incentive to keep pushing. So and like Bert said, I plan on doing some ridiculous things, in my early 50s. So
I love it. Well, I think with that, we've come to a close. Is there anything else you guys want to cover on the front of powerlifting in 2020 for 3DMJ?
No, I'm good unless Bert does.
I just want to encourage our pure bodybuilding fans, take a peek at what's going on in the IPF world, because it's super dope. When Worlds is on, it's I know exactly what I'm doing. And to me, it's crazy to say, I never thought I'd say this, but it's bigger to me than say the Super Bowl. I'm glued to that. And I find it that much more exciting. I think one, because I know a lot of those athletes there, a lot of them are my friends, but nevertheless, it's a super rad sport, and you should check it out and support those people.
I totally agree. Awesome. Well, thank you, gentlemen, and I hope you've all enjoyed us discussing how 3DMJ handles powerlifting in 2020. Hey, everybody. It's Eric Helms. Thanks for tuning into our podcast. As you know, at 3DMJ, we promote evidence-based approaches to the lifting community. If that's something you want to dive deeper into, I'd encourage you to check out my research review, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport, or for short, MASS. This is a review that myself, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Greg Knuckles put out every month. We cover the latest research publications that are applicable to strength and physique athletes, or anyone who's looking to get stronger or improve their body comp. Our content is in both written and video format. For more information on how to subscribe, check out 3dmusclejourney.com/mass. That's 3dmusclejourney.com/MASS for further details. Thanks for tuning in.